In the deepening twilight of April 18, 1775, with Boston trembling under the weight of British occupation, the legend of Paul Revere's midnight ride was born, a tale passed down through schoolbooks, patriotic poems, and collective memory. But like many stories wrapped in national mythology, the simplified version hardly captures the complexity, danger, and imperfect humanity of the event. This is not just the story of one man galloping boldly into history, it is the story of miscommunication, coordinated resistance, and a network of unsung patriots whose contributions were overshadowed by the glow of a single heroic figure. To understand what really happened that night, we must scrape away the polished veneer of Longfellow's famous poem and step into the raw, unsettling uncertainty of colonial America on the brink of war. Tension in Boston had been rising for years. British troops, red-coated reminders of imperial authority, patrolled the streets as Parliament tightened regulations and taxes on the colonies. Resistance groups like the Sons of Liberty were growing bolder, organizing protests, disseminating warnings, and using secret signals to communicate under the watchful eyes of British commanders. By the spring of 1775, General Thomas Gage was convinced that rebellion was imminent, and that disarming the colonists by seizing hidden caches of weapons was the only way to keep the peace. His intelligence pointed to the small town of Concord as the center of colonial munitions. If he could reach it quickly and quietly, he could crush the spark before it became a flame. But the Patriots had their own intelligence network, faster, more adaptable, and deeply embedded within the community. Silversmith Paul Revere was one of its most active operatives, valued not just for his trade but for his keen mind, deep connections, and ability to navigate Boston's shadowy political layers. He was not merely a writer, he was a courier, organizer, and intelligence officer long before those terms existed. By April 18, Revere already knew the British were preparing a major operation. What he didn't know was when they would move, or how far they would go. As British troops quietly assembled along the waterfront, Revere was stationed across the river in Charlestown, waiting for the signal that would alert Patriot leaders outside Boston that the regulars were on the march. The Old North Church, today a symbol of revolutionary defiance, was chosen as the signal tower. 2 lanterns in the belfry would indicate the British were crossing the Charles River by boat, 1 lantern would mean they were marching by land. Contrary to popular retellings, the lantern's signal was not meant for Revere himself. In fact, he was the one who organized it for others. His mission would depend on speed, secrecy, and coordination with fellow writer William Dawes, who left Boston by land through the guarded Boston Neck minutes before Revere crossed the river. The moment the 2 lanterns glowed in the church tower, reflecting off the dark waves of the Charles, Revere sprang into motion. With his rowboat's oars wrapped in cloth to muffle every stroke, he was ferried across the river under the nose of a British warship. Once ashore in Charlestown, he mounted a borrowed horse, a powerful, agile mare prepared for just this moment. What followed was not a wild gallop through silent, moonlit villages, as Longfellow romanticized, but a frantic relay of warnings delivered with urgency and strategic care. Revere alerted local patriots, rallying a network that had rehearsed this scenario for months. He shouted messages, knocked on doors, and coordinated with militiamen whose alarms quickly fanned outward across the countryside. Yet the popular image of the British are coming is inaccurate. At the time, most colonists still considered themselves British subjects. Revere's actual warning was more precise: the regulars are out. The distinction reveals much about the world he lived in, a world not yet fully committed to independence, where loyalties were divided and the future uncertain. The rhetoric of revolution had not yet crystallized into the national identity familiar today. Revere pressed on into the night, eventually meeting Dawes, who had taken the longer, more dangerous land route out of Boston. Both men continued toward Lexington, where Samuel Adams and John Hancock, key leaders in the Patriot movement, were staying. Their objective was not merely to warn the countryside, but to protect these high-value targets from potential arrest. The 2 riders succeeded, arriving in time to alert the prominent statesmen, who quickly prepared to evacuate. But the mission was far from over. Word had spread that the British column was heading toward Concord, and the riders turned west to continue their warning. At this point, the legend diverges sharply from reality. The most famous version, taught in classrooms for generations, suggests Revere rode alone into the night, completing a heroic, uninterrupted journey. In truth, the effort involved multiple riders, and Revere himself never reached Concord. Along the road, he and his companions encountered a British patrol. Dawes managed to escape after his horse threw him during the chaos. Another rider, Dr. Samuel Prescott, slipped away into the woods and completed the mission to Concord. But Paul Revere was captured. Surrounded by armed British officers, he was interrogated, threatened, and held under guard. Only with great luck, and perhaps the captor's own confusion about the size of the Patriot militia, was he eventually released. His horse, however, was taken, forcing him to continue on foot. The irony is profound. The man whose name became synonymous with the midnight ride did not finish it. He did not witness the first shots fired at Lexington Green. He did not reach Concord. And yet, the message he helped deliver set the stage for the opening battles of the American Revolution, where colonial militias faced British regulars in the first deadly confrontation of a long struggle for independence. The real power of Paul Revere's ride was not the lone heroism of one man, but the mobilization of a community. Church bells rang. Drums beat through quiet villages. Swift riders fanned out in every direction. Hundreds of men and women sprang into action, hiding supplies, readying weapons, and preparing for conflict. This decentralized, rapid response network outperformed the rigid structure of the British command, a lesson in the effectiveness of grassroots resistance. And yet, for all the complexity and collective effort, the myth of the solitary rider persists. Much of that comes from Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's 1860 poem, written nearly a century later, at a moment when America was fractured and heading towards civil war. Longfellow's intent was not historical accuracy but national inspiration. He crafted a narrative centered on a single heroic figure, a symbol meant to rally a divided nation around the idea of courage and unity. His Paul Revere was not just a man, he was an ideal. In the decades that followed, the poetic version overshadowed the historical truth. Textbooks adopted it, Hollywood dramatized it, and Paul Revere became an icon of American individualism, a lone rider who saved the revolution. But the real story is richer, messier, and more human. It is a story of networks, collaboration, failure, and improvisation. It is a story of people whose names were forgotten or overlooked. And it is a story of how history bends under the weight of national memory, reshaping events into legends that serve the needs of future generations. The truth does not diminish Paul Revere's courage. If anything, it enriches it. He was not the perfect hero of poetry, he was a determined, resourceful patriot operating under immense pressure, part of a larger system that relied on countless ordinary people. His ride, interrupted though it was, helped trigger the first sparks of a war that would reshape the world. As dawn approached on April 19, 1775, the countryside surrounding Boston was alive with movement. What had begun hours earlier as a covert march by British regulars had become a chain reaction of alarms spreading outward from one village to the next. The network of patriot riders, dozens of unnamed men moving with speed and purpose, had transformed Paul Revere's initial warning into a widespread mobilization. To truly grasp the struggle of that morning, we must zoom out from the single rider's tale and observe the broader machinery of colonial resistance, its flaws, its brilliance, and the unpredictable human elements that shaped the dawn of the American Revolution. By the time the British column reached Lexington, the militias were already assembling. This was not the effortless coordination of an organized army, but the improvised response of farmers, merchants, and ordinary townsmen who had drilled periodically in fields and barns. Some grasped their weapons with practiced readiness, others arrived half-dressed, breathless, unsure whether the rumors were true. Still, they gathered, not with the certainty of victory but with the conviction that their freedoms were at stake. The militia's purpose was not to start a war but to show resistance, to stand visibly between British authority and colonial autonomy. The British regulars, numbering around 700, marched with the precision of a professional army. Their red coats glowed faintly in the early light, their muskets held in disciplined formation. But their commander on the ground, Major John Pitcairn, faced uncertainty. Intelligence had reached him in scattered fragments. He knew of the colonial stockpiles, yet the resistance he now encountered was far more organized than expected. Gone was the element of surprise. Instead, the British advanced into an increasingly mobilized landscape, one that shifted from peaceful countryside to tense resistance. As the first rays of morning light filtered through the mist, the confrontation at Lexington Green unfolded. The Patriot militia, numbering only about 70, stood before the advancing British troops. The tension was palpable, both sides unsure of how far the other was willing to go. Contrary to popular imagery, the militia did not block the road. They formed a loose line near the village green, a symbolic stand rather than a barricade. Captain John Parker, their leader, instructed his men not to provoke or fire upon the British. His hope was to make a statement, not ignite a war. What happened next has been debated for centuries. A shot rang out, sharp, singular, mysterious. No one could later say with certainty who fired it. Both sides would blame the other, each claiming innocence. But the consequences were immediate and tragic. British soldiers, startled and under orders to maintain control, fired a volley into the scattered militia. Men fell where they stood. Some attempted to flee, others raised their muskets in desperate self-defense. When the smoke cleared, 8 colonists lay dead, and the rest retreated in shock and disbelief. The first blood of the American Revolution had been spilled. Yet even as Lexington mourned its losses, events were rapidly escalating. The British column pressed onward toward Concord, determined to locate and seize the colonial munitions. But the alarm system Revere and his fellow riders had activated was now working at full capacity. By the time the troops reached Concord, hundreds of militiamen had converged from surrounding towns, forming a growing, unpredictable force. The British found fewer supplies than expected. Much had been hidden or moved in anticipation of the raid, evidence of the Patriots' well-coordinated espionage network. The turning point came at the North Bridge, just outside Concord. Militiamen, massing on the high ground, watched as British soldiers burned wooden gun carriages. From a distance, the smoke appeared as if the entire town was ablaze, provoking the militia into action. They advanced in a coordinated line, no longer the small group at Lexington Green but a larger and more resolute force. When the British opened fire, the militia responded with disciplined volleys, forcing the regulars to retreat. This clash marked the first time colonists had successfully stood their ground against British troops in open battle. Meanwhile, Paul Revere, having been released by his British captors, made his way back toward Lexington, now on foot and stripped of his horse. He arrived not at a triumphant scene of resistance but at the aftermath of the skirmish, surrounded by confusion and grief. Revere's mission had changed. No longer carrying a warning, he now helped Samuel Adams and John Hancock complete their evacuation. His role shifted from messenger to guardian, reflecting the fluid, improvisational nature of that chaotic morning. As the British began their long march back to Boston, they encountered something far more dangerous than a single militia unit. The colonial alarm network had drawn hundreds of armed men from dozens of towns, forming an ever-growing ring around the retreating troops. These were not soldiers in uniformed lines. They were farmers firing from behind stone walls, hunters striking from wooded hills, blacksmiths and shopkeepers who knew every bend and dip of the terrain. Their tactics resembled what we now call guerrilla warfare: stealth, surprise, and mobility against a rigid, slow-moving force. For the British, the march back to Boston turned into a desperate struggle for survival. They suffered heavy casualties as colonists fired from behind trees, fences, and barns, fading into the countryside before the regulars could respond. The disciplined formations that had carried the British across the Atlantic now made them vulnerable. Each mile became a gauntlet of ambushes, each step a reminder that the colonial resistance was far larger, more organized, and more determined than anyone in London had imagined. By early afternoon, British reinforcements arrived, preventing complete disaster. But the damage, in both morale and perception, was severe. The myth of British invincibility had been shattered. Word of the clashes at Lexington and Concord spread rapidly throughout the colonies, carried by riders who continued the alarm system long after Revere's part had ended. The story grew with each telling: British aggression, colonial bravery, the first victories of a people unwilling to surrender their rights. But here's where myth and reality begin to blend. In the aftermath of the battles, the public narrative subtly shifted. Paul Revere's role, though important, was magnified beyond the contributions of others. Figures like William Dawes, Samuel Prescott, Israel Bissell, and countless unnamed writers faded into the background. Their efforts, equally crucial, equally brave, were not captured in poetry or immortalized in paintings. History began to mold the narrative into a simpler, more compelling story, one man alone in the night, warning a sleeping nation of danger. The deeper truth is far more remarkable. The colonial resistance succeeded not because of one heroic writer but because of a decentralized network of ordinary people willing to act quickly and decisively. Blacksmiths, farmers, ministers, housewives, teenagers, all played roles in the alarm system. Lanterns, church bells, gunshots, riders, each served as a node in a communication web that outmaneuvered an empire. Paul Revere's journey, while interrupted, was a catalyst. But the full story reveals something richer, that revolutions are not sparked by lone heroes but by communities ready to defend their beliefs. The Midnight Ride was not the act of a single man, it was the awakening of a people. In the weeks that followed Lexington and Concord, the Midnight Ride took on a life of its own, growing from a local tale of quick-thinking patriots into a symbolic story retold in taverns, newspapers, and political gatherings. But while Paul Revere's name slowly surfaced as one of the figures involved in the alarm system of April 18 and 19, 1775, he was far from the celebrated national hero he would later become. In fact, for decades, Revere was known primarily as a craftsman, a skilled silversmith, engraver, and early industrialist, not as the lone savior of the Revolution. To understand how the Midnight Ride evolved into the iconic American myth we know today, we must travel forward in time and examine how memory, politics, and storytelling shaped Revere's legacy. The immediate aftermath of the battles placed the colonies on an irreversible path to war. In the coming months, militia units transformed into the Continental Army under the leadership of George Washington. Diplomacy shifted toward independence. And the narrative of British aggression at Lexington and Concord became a rallying cry for the patriot cause. Yet amid these massive changes, the individuals involved in the alarm network, including Revere, Dawes, Prescott, and dozens of lesser-known writers, were not thrust onto pedestals. Their contributions were acknowledged locally but did not yet occupy the national spotlight. Paul Revere himself returned to Boston as the siege began, resuming his role within the Patriot movement. He served as a courier again, carried intelligence, and later supervised artillery units. His military career had moments of both competence and controversy, including his involvement in the ill-fated Penobscot expedition of 1779, which brought him accusations of insubordination. Though later cleared of wrongdoing, the event cast a long shadow over his service record. At this time, there was no indication that he would one day be immortalized as a legendary hero of the Revolution. But even as the war unfolded, traces of the Midnight Ride lingered within his family papers. In 1798, Revere wrote a detailed account of the events leading up to his capture. His intention was not to craft a dramatic narrative, but to correct inaccuracies being circulated about who warned whom and when. His document was precise, factual, and largely void of embellishment, far from the romanticized tone that later generations would associate with the ride. It was merely a personal recollection from an aging craftsman who wished to set the record straight. For nearly 60 years after the Revolution, Revere's story remained just that, a footnote in the broader history of the struggle for independence. William Dawes and Samuel Prescott, whose contributions were equally, if not more crucial, received little recognition. The real network of dozens of writers, women who organized supplies, enslaved men who delivered intelligence, and communities that mobilized with incredible speed were almost entirely forgotten. American memory had not yet crafted the Midnight Ride into the legend it would become. Everything changed in 1860. On the eve of the American Civil War, the United States was fractured, fragile, and uncertain. The bonds between North and South were unraveling, and the possibility of national collapse seemed imminent. Against this backdrop, poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow sought to create a story that would remind Americans of their shared heritage, their common struggle, and their collective identity. In this political climate, he penned the poem that transformed Paul Revere from a historical figure into a national icon. Listen, my children, and you shall hear. Of the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere, the opening lines were simple, rhythmic, easy to memorize, ideal for classroom recitation and national mythology. But more importantly, Longfellow deliberately shaped the poem as a unifying narrative. He wanted to rekindle patriotism at a moment when Americans were divided. To accomplish this, he needed a hero who was noble, bold, and unambiguous, a symbol of courage, urgency, and unity. Paul Revere fit the mold perfectly, especially when stripped of the complexities and imperfections of real history. Longfellow compressed the multi-rider alarm system into a single, solitary journey. He transformed a chaotic relay of warnings into a seamless mission led by one brave figure. He dramatized the imagery, the silent river, the shadowy church tower, the lonely horseman racing through the night. His Revere was not the man who was stopped by a British patrol, he was the embodiment of American determination. It worked. Almost instantly, the poem took root. Generations of schoolchildren learned Revere's name from Longfellow's verses. Teachers recited it each April during patriotic ceremonies. Artists illustrated the poem in textbooks. Newspapers quoted it. Revere's Ride became one of the most recognizable stories in American history, even though the poem openly sacrificed accuracy for impact. But this raises a critical question: why did the Revere myth resonate so deeply? Part of the answer lies in the American preference for individual heroism. Throughout history, Americans have gravitated toward narratives featuring singular, decisive figures, those who embody the nation's highest values. The idea that one man could ride through the night to warn of danger aligns with a cultural tradition that celebrates independence, resolve, and personal bravery. Revere became a symbol of what Americans wished to believe about themselves. Another factor was the emotional need for unity during the Civil War. Longfellow's poem reminded Northern audiences of a time when Americans banded together against a common threat. It presented a narrative of shared origins, one where courage defeated tyranny, and where individuals could change the course of history. In this way, the poem served as a cultural anchor, anchoring the fractured nation in a sense of collective memory. But perhaps the most surprising aspect of Revere's rise to fame is how thoroughly it overshadowed others. William Dawes, who rode the land route out of Boston and faced significant danger, virtually disappeared from the national narrative. Samuel Prescott, who actually completed the ride to Concord after Revere was captured, received only scattered recognition. The dozens of unnamed riders, the households that lit candles and signaled across fields, the blacksmiths who hammered their alarm guns, all were erased by the simplicity of a single hero's tale. This simplification reveals an important truth about national myths: they are crafted not by historians but by storytellers. Myths persist because they are easy to remember, emotionally powerful, and symbolically potent. And once a narrative becomes woven into the cultural fabric, it resists correction. Even today, most Americans learn the poem before they learn the history. Yet rejecting the myth entirely would miss the point. Longfellow's story, though inaccurate, helped preserve a piece of the nation's past. It kept Paul Revere's name alive long enough for historians to rediscover his real contributions. And while the poem distorted the facts, it also sparked interest in the deeper story, a story richer and more complex than the myth itself. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, historians began re-examining the events of April 18th and 19th. They uncovered forgotten documents, diaries, and correspondence. They reintroduced figures like Dawes and Prescott into the narrative. They studied the alarm networks, the militia structures, and the intelligence systems that made the Patriots' response possible. And slowly, the true story of the Midnight Ride came back into focus. This resurgence of scholarly interest also coincided with a broader preservation movement. Historic sites associated with the Revolution, including the Old North Church, the Lexington Green, and later Revere's own home, were restored, marked, and turned into public landmarks. These efforts blended myth and history, allowing visitors to stand where events happened while guided by narratives shaped by both fact and national pride. The dual legacy of the Midnight Ride, one factual, one mythical, continues to this day. The historical Revere was a multifaceted figure: artisan, courier, organizer, businessman. The mythical Revere, forged by Longfellow, is the lone rider racing through the night. Both identities coexist, each telling a different story about America's past. One reveals the messy realities of coordinated resistance, the other speaks to the timeless human desire to find meaning and heroism in our origins. As we continue this exploration, we must recognize that myths are not lies, they are cultural expressions. They show what people value, what they fear, and what they aspire to be. But to understand history, we must balance myth with truth. And the truth of the Midnight Ride is a story far greater than one man on a horse. As the story of Paul Revere's Midnight Ride evolved through the 19th and 20th centuries, so did America's relationship with its own past. Historical memory is never static, it bends, expands, contracts, and adapts based on the needs of the generation interpreting it. What began as a local tale of resistance became a national legend, and then, gradually, an object of scholarly debate. And yet, beneath all the layers of myth and patriotism, the real human drama of the Midnight Ride remained, waiting to be re-examined, reinterpreted, and restored. To fully understand how this transformation unfolded, we must examine how Americans used the Revere story at different points in history. In the decades following Longfellow's poem, the image of Revere as the heroic lone rider was woven into the fabric of national education. Schoolbooks simplified the narrative to reinforce civic pride. Teachers recited the poem as a means of instilling patriotism. Monuments were erected in towns associated with the ride. Streets, schools, and ships were named after Revere. This emerging iconography was powerful, but it also narrowed the field of vision, focusing so intently on the legend that the broader reality of the event faded into obscurity. Yet, as America modernized, historians began questioning the neatness of the poetic version. The Progressive Era brought with it a new kind of historical inquiry, one that sought documentation, primary sources, and verifiable evidence. Researchers discovered that the alarm system of April 18th and 19th was far more intricate than previously understood. New names emerged from forgotten journals and militia logs: Israel Bissell, who rode all the way to Connecticut; Abel Prescott, Samuel's brother, who carried warnings to smaller villages, and dozens of others whose contributions were lost to time. These rediscoveries expanded the narrative far beyond the familiar image of a solitary figure galloping along dusty colonial roads. The growing clarity about the Midnight Ride's complexity also illuminated an important truth: the Patriots operated not as a collection of isolated heroes, but as an interconnected community with shared goals and coordinated strategies. This perspective revealed how essential the local knowledge, personal networks, and social cohesion of New England towns were to the success of the alarm. Every rider depended on someone willing to open a door at midnight. Every warning required families willing to light candles or ring bells. Every passing message demanded trust. The Midnight Ride worked because the people themselves were the signal system. As scholars pieced together the broader picture, they also re-examined Revere's personal motivations. The heroic veneer applied to him by Longfellow obscured the man beneath, a craftsman deeply involved in the political and economic concerns of his time. Revere's activities prior to the Midnight Ride show him not as a spontaneous savior, but as an organized, strategic thinker who spent years working within the Patriot intelligence network. His famous Boston Massacre engraving, though somewhat exaggerated, helped galvanize public opinion against British occupation. His participation in the Sons of Liberty and his involvement in the Boston Tea Party demonstrated his commitment to resistance long before the ride. Revere was also a businessman navigating the hardships imposed by British trade restrictions. His political engagement was intertwined with practical survival. When viewed through this lens, the Midnight Ride becomes not an isolated act of heroism but part of a larger continuum, a life dedicated to the defense of colonial autonomy and personal livelihood. By placing him back within this broader context, we see not just a rider on horseback, but an individual shaped by economic pressures, ideological conviction, and a network of like-minded patriots. Yet even as historians corrected misconceptions, the myth remained deeply entrenched. It appeared in children's literature, patriotic films, and school plays. Revere's home in Boston became a museum, attracting tourists who came to see the dwelling of the Midnight Hero. The Old North Church preserved its iconic lanterns, though not the originals, as symbols of American independence. The story, though simplified, offered something powerful, a sense of continuity between past and present, an affirmation that ordinary individuals could alter the course of history. This raises a central question: what is the relationship between myth and identity? Myths are not necessarily created to deceive, they emerge because societies need symbols. They need stories that inspire, unify, and instruct. But myths also obscure the contributions of those who do not fit the narrative mold. William Dawes, for instance, was a patriot of equal courage who rode through a heavily guarded land route, yet his name remains largely unknown outside academic circles. Dr. Samuel Prescott completed the ride to Concord, but he lacked the poetic alliteration and iconic imagery that helped Revere's name endure. Dozens of other riders, some of whom risked as much or more, received no recognition at all. By elevating one individual, the myth inadvertently diminished the rest. This pattern is common in national histories. The Rosa Parks story often overshadows the courage of Claudette Colvin. Thomas Edison eclipses the contributions of lesser-known inventors. George Washington's myth leaves little space for the ordinary soldiers who endured Valley Forge. The Midnight Ride fits comfortably within this broader trend, a complex event distilled into a memorable narrative centered on a single, charismatic figure. Understanding this dynamic does not diminish Revere's achievement, it clarifies it. He was not a superhero. He was a citizen engaged in collective resistance. His true legacy lies not in solitary heroics, but in his role as part of a coordinated movement that outpaced one of the most powerful military forces in the world. When we restore this context, Revere's courage becomes even more meaningful, because it reflects the courage of hundreds of others. Another important aspect of the true story is its multicultural and socio-economic diversity. The alarm system included enslaved men who passed along warnings, Native Americans who tracked British troop positions, and women who organized supplies, relayed intelligence, and sheltered riders. These contributions rarely appear in the mythologized version of the Midnight Ride, yet they reveal how interconnected the colonial society truly was. The revolution was not won solely by silversmiths and farmers, it was propelled by people from all walks of life. Consider Sybil Ludington, a 16-year-old girl from New York who rode twice as far as Revere to rally local militia against British forces in 1777. Her story, though historically documented, never gained the national attention that Revere's received. Why? Because Longfellow's poem had already cemented Revere as the archetype. The nation did not need another writer, it needed only the idea embodied in his story. This selective spotlighting shows how myth can shape the memory of entire eras. As America moved into the 20th century, the Revere story gained new life during both world wars, when patriotism surged and the nation sought examples of bravery and unity. Posters, radio broadcasts, and films once again evoked the image of the lone rider. During the Cold War, Revere's tale became a symbol of vigilance against threats. In the post-9/11 era, it resurfaced in discussions about civic duty and national alertness. The Midnight Ride, though centuries old, continued to serve contemporary purposes. Yet modern historians and educators have increasingly emphasized the realities behind the legend. Museums now present the Midnight Ride as a complex operation involving many participants. New textbooks highlight Dawes, Prescott, and the broader network. Society has begun to embrace a more nuanced understanding, one that honors both the myth and the truth. The goal is not to dismantle Revere's place in American memory, but to widen the narrative. When we acknowledge the collective nature of the Midnight Ride, we celebrate not only Revere but the entire community that made resistance possible. We recognize that revolutions are rarely the work of lone heroes, they are the result of shared courage, coordinated action, and the willingness of many individuals to step forward when the moment demands it. Through this lens, the Midnight Ride becomes a story not of a single man, but of a society awakening together. It becomes a testament to the power of unity, communication, and ordinary people rising to extraordinary challenges. As we reach the final part of this exploration, we turn from the past to the present, and to the enduring legacy of Paul Revere's midnight ride in American culture, education, and identity. More than 2 centuries after that tense April night, the story continues to hold a powerful place in the national imagination. But why does the event remain so significant? What lessons does it continue to offer? And what does the interplay between myth and reality tell us about how societies remember their origins? The Midnight Ride's endurance in American memory owes much to its emotional resonance. At its core, it is a story about one of humanity's most ancient fears, the fear of an approaching threat in the darkness. And it is a story about one of humanity's most enduring hopes, that someone will sound the alarm, that danger will not catch us sleeping, that individuals with courage will rise when history demands it. This universal theme gives the story of Paul Revere its timeless appeal. It translates across generations, making it more than a historical incident. It becomes a moral lesson, a symbol, and a national metaphor. Yet the deeper truth, obscured by centuries of simplification, is far richer. The Midnight Ride was not the heroic sprint of a single rider but a coordinated warning system built upon the trust and readiness of a community. Understanding this complexity makes the story no less inspiring. Indeed, it reveals something even more profound, that revolutions are born not from singular acts of heroism but from collective action. They arise when everyday people recognize their moment and choose to act together, even at personal risk. In modern classrooms, this fuller narrative allows students to see the revolution not as a series of isolated moments led by extraordinary men, but as a sweeping movement propelled by farmers, artisans, teenagers, ministers, merchants, enslaved people, free black men and women, native allies, and countless others whose names have been lost to history. It transforms the past from a gallery of heroes into a living tapestry of human perseverance. And in doing so, it invites students to see themselves not just as admirers of history but as potential participants in the shaping of their own moment. The Midnight Ride also opens conversations about the nature of communication. Today we live in a world where information travels instantly across continents, yet the events of April 1775 remind us of a time when warnings moved at the speed of hoofbeats, lantern signals, and church bells. The Patriot alarm system was an early example of decentralized communication, flexible, resilient, and fast. In many ways, it resembled the logic behind modern networks, multiple nodes transmitting information simultaneously to ensure that even if one link failed, the message would still reach its destination. This comparison highlights a forgotten truth about the Patriots' success. They outsmarted the British not with superior weapons or greater numbers, but with superior information. Revere and his network embodied the intelligence infrastructure of the Revolution. Their effectiveness reminds us of the timeless importance of communication in any struggle, whether on battlefields, in social movements, or in political change. Yet the shifting narrative of the Midnight Ride also teaches us that history is not fixed. It evolves. It is interpreted, reinterpreted, forgotten, rediscovered, shaped, and reshaped. What one generation considers heroic, another may reconsider as symbolic or even incomplete. And this is not a flaw, it is the nature of historical memory. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's poem, for all its inaccuracies, had a purpose. It gave the nation a story when it desperately needed one. It crafted a symbol of unity during a time of division. And it ensured that Paul Revere, who might otherwise have remained a minor regional figure, entered the national consciousness. Longfellow's poem is not a historical document, it is a cultural artifact. And like all cultural artifacts, it reveals as much about the people who created it as it does about the events it describes. But as society matured, so did its appetite for truth. Scholars began peeling back the layers of myth, uncovering the documents, correspondences, and testimonies that allowed for a more accurate retelling of the events. Museums, teachers, and historians now walk a careful line, presenting both the legend and the truth, honoring the symbolic power of the myth while respecting the integrity of the historical record. In the modern era, new mediums offer even more ways to explore the Midnight Ride. Films, documentaries, historical novels, virtual reality experiences, interactive museum exhibits, all have revisited the event from fresh angles. Some highlight the drama of Revere's individual journey, others focus on the broader network, still others emphasize the role of lesser-known figures like Dawes and Prescott. Each retelling adds texture to the story, allowing audiences to connect with the past in new ways. One of the most fascinating developments in recent years is the growing public recognition of forgotten writers and contributors. Samuel Prescott, once relegated to the footnotes, is now increasingly recognized as the man who actually reached Concord. William Dawes, long overshadowed, is finally being acknowledged as Revere's partner in the alarm. Local museums and towns along their routes have begun to tell their stories more prominently. Even towns that once only celebrated Revere have embraced a more inclusive understanding of the collective effort. And yet, despite all the revisions, Paul Revere still stands as a symbol not of solitary heroism, but of readiness, vigilance, and commitment to one's community. His story resonates today not because it is perfect, but because it is relatable. Revere was not a mythical figure. He was an ordinary man who stepped forward in extraordinary circumstances. He was a citizen who believed in a cause greater than himself. He was someone who risked his safety for the sake of others. In this sense, the Midnight Ride serves as a reminder that history is shaped by people who act, rather than people who wait. It reminds us that the first step toward change is often taken by individuals who refuse to remain passive. It teaches us that the actions of a community, cooperating, communicating, and supporting one another, can alter the course of a nation. As we reflect on the lessons of the Midnight Ride, one truth emerges clearly: myths can inspire, but realities can empower. The myth of Paul Revere tells us that heroes are bold. The reality of the Midnight Ride tells us that communities are powerful. And when we weave both together, we find a deeper truth, one that honors both the symbol and the substance of this extraordinary night. Today, visitors can walk the Freedom Trail in Boston, stand in the Old North Church, and gaze up at the steeple where the lanterns once shone. They can step inside Revere's preserved home, imagining the silversmith preparing for his urgent journey. They can follow the historic roads to Lexington and Concord, tracing the path that launched a revolution. These sites serve as bridges between past and present, allowing us to feel the echoes of history beneath our feet. But the most powerful legacy of the Midnight Ride does not live in places, it lives in ideas. It lives in the belief that citizens, informed and engaged, can rise to meet the challenges of their time. It lives in the recognition that freedom is not granted from above but defended from below. And it lives in the enduring reminder that the story of America is not the story of one hero, but the story of many voices united by common purpose. In the end, the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere is both myth and reality. It is a poem and a document. It is a legend and a collection of facts. And it is a mirror, reflecting not just the world of 1775, but the values of every generation that has retold it.